I'll close with this quick section on energy. We just sort of ran through these things because they'll help support the process. So big story here, of course, is that India's energy intensity is much lower than the rest of the world in a whole range of indicators. I'll skip over that very quickly. But the interesting sort of long range trend here is this red line here, in a sense shows the decoupling or the beginning of the decoupling between GDP and energy intensity, which is happening over time. The challenge for us, of course, is that in the recent period, specifically here, and you can see it in these two periods, in the last growth spurt that's there, there's an increasing carbonization of the energy system. So there was an earlier process which you can see here, where effectively what we find is that there's a decarbonization, there's a delinking of energy intensity from economic growth, but that's shifted in the last 5 years or so. Next. So if you follow that through, basically the improvement in system efficiency in the energy sector has reduced in the last 5 or 6 years. Obviously, this has got to do with how the electricity sector is doing, what the mix of the challenge that we're having on the coal front, etc., etc. But I guess the short sort of synopsis of that story is this system efficiency that's there needs to improve dramatically if we're not to reduce our sort of oil and import bills significantly. Now, the challenge for us, especially in the last year and a half or two, as oil prices have gone down, is that the price signals that would normally have driven this are absent in the market, which means that from the regulatory side we have to be very careful, otherwise we'll be trapped in a situation where you're starting to grow rapidly, but you're doing that with a much more energy inefficient system, which is going to hurt you in the long run. And I guess the big challenge for us is that we are about 70% dependent on coal and oil. So we're a fossil fuel driven economy that's growing very rapidly, and energy demand is also growing along with that simultaneously. Yet, and this is a sort of dualism in our economy, about a quarter of our energy comes from traditional sources, which basically means rural areas, residential consumption, fuel wood, dung, etc., and also small enterprises use a tremendous amount of traditional energy as far as that's concerned. So the bad news for us in this graph is that, this is a graph that shows it, is that our share of clean energy sources is only 3%. We're pushing for more wind, this huge big solar revolution, etc., but the base is 3%. So even if we treble it, we're only going to go to 10% of consumption. And you want to grow the economy at 7-8%, which means that with 70% coming from fossil fuels, you're actually, and this is something that sort of is very disturbing, you're locked into a system that may be very difficult to change, which means international competitiveness, environmental impact, etc., 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 are a deep concern. And what's driving this? It's urban demand. Okay, urban commercial, manufacturing, and increasingly now transportation demand. Next slide. You see that. So if you look at the demand story as far as we're concerned, this is the breakdown here. Agriculture relatively small, residential quite big, commercial on the top there, transportation growing quite quickly, especially in the last 5 years or so, and of course industry. We have energy intensive industry, we're still in primary manufacturing in some places, and if you look at the breakdown sector by sector, you can see obvious things that are there. So in agriculture, 88% using fossil fuels. Why? Because we're using diesel engines to pump in most locations, because power availability is really bad for power. Same thing as far as interesting, as I said, 75% biomass used for residential, 36% for commercial activity from residential. So electricity, which by and large is the most efficient way of actually delivering these services, seriously challenging. This is the industry mix: 18% electricity, 47% of coal. So you can obviously see that sector by sector, the fuels that actually drive this process in some cases are quite strongly locked in. And gas, which we hope to actually to help make sort of a transition to both greater efficiency and decarbonization, is actually penetrating much lower than we would have liked it to be. So I guess the more that we look at this question, and as you break it down state by state, the lock-in that we're experiencing is not is not very nice to look at. It, in fact, it's quite scary. Keep going. Now this is a spaghetti, but I'll explain it to you very quickly. These are two diagrams that look at the flow of energy from source, coal, oil, biomass, to end use. Residential uses, industry, transportation, and of course the big story here, energy losses, fine. And this looks at it over 2000 and 2011. So it's a 10-year period. Now what's hidden in this, because the graphs are too small, is that over this period of time, the actual volume of this has gone up by what, Amit, 3 times? Whatever, something of that order. So that's the graph up there. So what you're seeing in this one is that little box at the bottom. What you're seeing on that one is a big box on the other side. So what's happening here? Basically, we're an economy that's driven entirely by fossil fuels, specifically on the urban side, and this is the biomass flows that come in, and biomass flows actually into everything, at least 10 years ago, into the residential sector, into industrial sector, and of course a little bit of the other things. But the big challenge for us, if you look at this whole thing, is that our energy losses that are there at 140 million tons oil equivalent are almost equal to our residential demand. This is in 2000, fine? So the real question that we've not addressed for the last 10 years, or actually 15 years, since some of us have been working on this thing, is really power sector reform. That is where the core story lies. And if you look at this 10-year period, it hasn't changed very much. In fact, now our energy losses at 241 MTOE is more than our residential demand, because there's a lot of stuff that's happening here in terms of energy efficiency, light bulb changes, in spite of population growth as far as that's concerned. So we in some senses are not changing very dramatically. Biomass is still there, even though as you can see, biomass has gone down from from a larger to a smaller proportion, which in some ways is a good thing, both environmentally in terms of indoor air quality as far as they're concerned. Natural gas has picked up in some ways, and this is a great Gujarat story. Maybe Andhra Pradesh will actually pick itself up. But if we do not address this question, we are in deep trouble. And this is a hard political question. I know that 2 chief ministers have lost the elections on this question, both in Andhra Pradesh and Madhya Pradesh, and that still rings in the political imagination. So this is something that takes some understanding, including the question that we're dealing with just now. Transportation growing. This is at 75 MTOE, growing from here at about 30 MTOE. So over a 10-year period, more than 2.5 times growth in the energy used for transportation. Okay, so this is deeply unsustainable, and we need to do something about it. However, if you don't have mobility in the system, you're not going to get economic development and growth. So it's a very interesting challenge in the process. Next slide. We're just going to close this now. So basically, what you find here is energy poverty is a serious question, and there are a whole range of issues there. We've taken down the administered price mechanism just now. So kerosene, for example, appears only in particular categories, but this is something that we need to look at. So equity and access issues are quite important in terms of energy. Keep going. Oops. Okay. Great. Thanks. Good. So anyway, so just to wrap up very quickly, what we tried to show you today is that we do have enough evidence and data to start drilling down and making the connection on what needs to get done. I wouldn't say at the sub-ward level, but certainly the ward level upwards. And this is all secondary information. I mean, we've analyzed it and worked with it, but this is available for us. And that gives us much better context to start looking at the linkages that we're dealing with. The challenge, of course, is much of what we're dealing with is very sectoral. We don't connect, let's say, transportation modes with air pollution, link that back to fatalities, link that back to urban structure. And what we're hoping to do over today and tomorrow is to get into those kind of questions, the cross-sectoral linkages, the multi-scalar questions, and of course the central issues inside that, which is of governance and financing, and how to make this thing actually work. And I guess the big elephant in the room, of course, is that all these ideas are nice, but in most cases we neither have the imagination nor the institutional capacities to make this happen. So those of us who are actually trying to effect reform on the ground really struggle, because to find 5 people to work with you to actually implement this stuff in a big place, forgetting about a small place, don't exist. So I think the big constraint for us is institutional capacities to make this happen, enabling people to try and see this thing, getting the dialogue together between the private sector, state and national government in some cases, getting the financing together and trying to make it work. Some places have done it quite well, but people ask me this question in many parts of the world and say, look, give us one great example of an Indian city that works. And the reality is that some parts of some cities work very well. So you have in some places a good metro system, and other places a good transportation system, somewhere else the water supply works. But there are very few places where everything works for the citizens. And I think we have to get beyond that barrier in hopefully less than 5 years or 10 years at the most. So I leave you with that. Thanks very much for the patience. And
no question, we need chai and coffee. Please go out and come back in half an hour. 12 o'clock, we'll be back here in this room. Thank you very much.